Okay, we are live. Welcome, everyone. Sorry, we are running a few minutes behind. Tech troubles, starting to get used to them. I don't know if that's a good thing. We do have some issues with our deck today, so that's why you might not see the clean full screen mode for our presentation. But you know what? The main thing that we all are looking forward to today is Yitong's talk. So really excited to be hosting Yitong Zhang. He is originally from Toronto, but now works in the Valley, works at Coinbase, and he's talking all about the dark art of navigating workplace politics. So again, a topic that's not often talked about in our community. I think in any community for that matter. But it is definitely a skill that I personally experienced can completely change the trajectory of your path, at least within a company. So really excited to hear his opinions, his learnings, his experiences. The talk is going to be about 20 minutes, and then we have at least 15 minutes for Q&A. And I imagine on this topic, we'll be getting a lot of questions and a lot of folks interested in sharing their own experiences. So let's go ahead. I hope many of you who are joining us are already part of our DesignX community. For those of you who are not part of the community or are landing on this virtual talk for the first time and hearing about DesignX the first time, just to give you a very quick overview, we are a global design community. We started about 3.5 years ago in Toronto, but over the last 3.5 years, our physical chapters have expanded much beyond Toronto to New York, Vancouver, Amsterdam, and even done events in Montreal and London. Especially when COVID hit, the silver lining was that geographic boundaries were not a constraint for us to bring designers together and elevate their learning. So we've been hosting a lot of these virtual online events and talks. We also have two large online communities. One is the DesignX community, which is the parent community where we have all intersectional form of designers in our community. And then we have a separate group of design leaders that are part of our design leadership community. We also host a lot of, since COVID hit, since March, hosting a lot of events and workshops online. In the past, we've done a lot of in-person events and conferences as well. Not sure when we're going to go back to that. Beyond that, we also create a lot of community-focused resources, any kind of learnings and curated collections that we can put together to help designers in our community. So if you go to designx.community/jobs, we have a job board with opportunities for designers. A lot of them are focused on North America, but we are starting to see more diversity and get more jobs from Europe and Asia as well. We also have a weekly newsletter that we send out that you can subscribe to. And last but not the least, just yesterday, we launched on Product Hunt our conference directory, which can be viewed on conferences.design. It's a curated collection of design conferences with all the updated info around conferences that have gone virtual, ticket prices have changed, schedules have changed. So you can find all of that and more on conferences.design. All of these exciting community initiatives, community building that we do, would not be possible without the support of our partners and sponsors. So massive shout out to Intersect. Intersect is one of the leading digital product agencies in Toronto. You can learn more about them at weareintersect.com. And during the talk, there will be a lot of exciting content, exciting learnings shared today. So if you are going out, tweeting about it, posting it on social, our team really appreciates when you include us in those conversations as well. So do tag us at wearedesignx. That's our social handle. And you could also use the hashtag wearedesignx. That makes it easy for our team to discover content that you're sharing. So I'm not going to take a lot more time. It's 12:15. The talk is going to go until for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll make sure we have 10-15 minutes at the end to answer any questions that folks watching might have today. So let's have some virtual applause and welcome Yitong Zhang. Yitong is a designer and occasional product manager at Coinbase. He's working on the core product and design systems there. He is also the maker of Autoflow, a very popular Figma plugin. So welcome, Yitong. I think you are muted. No worries.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, nice to meet you guys. Thanks for having me on. Okay. Well, let's get started. So, how to navigate organizations as a IC designer. I started wanting to talk about this because it's something that I think, as Preet mentioned, we don't really talk a lot in the open, and it's something that I've personally struggled with a lot. And so I thought that, hey, I should probably just do the thing that I think more other people should do, which is to start talking about this stuff in the open. So here I am. I don't have all the answers, but I will be watching the chat. So if you have any thoughts or questions, I'll tap into the chat once in a while and take a look at them too, so that we can try to make this a relatively interactive session. And if not, we'll just try to pick up all the questions at the end too. Okay, so this is another way of thinking about this, right? Navigating organizations, if you really want to put it like crudely, is how to politics. Politics is a loaded word. I think we all have different definitions of it. Comes with a lot of baggage, with some negative connotation. And I think another potentially more useful way of talking about this is how to affect change that you believe in. And I think that's kind of the angle that I want to take in this talk, right? So it's like you're an IC and your job isn't necessarily to do all of this stuff, but you have opinions and you think there are better ways of doing things and there are less better ways of doing things. And you would like your organization to do the way that you think is better. And this is how to do it. Okay, so about me. I grew up in Canada, so shout out everybody from Montreal and Toronto. And that's where I studied organizational behavior at McGill. So for those of you who might not have heard of this jargon, this is basically the study of sociology in workplace teams. Did this in business school, and I was like, cool, okay, well, this is like fun, but it's social sciences, right? Like you're never going to use it in real life. And then I started working at Coinbase as a designer, and then later a more senior designer. And all of a sudden, I'm like, whoa, shit! Like all of these things that I've learned about in the textbook kind of play out in real life, like the way that our professors describe them. So I was like, that's kind of crazy that I actually use what I learned in social sciences at work. I don't think a lot of people get to say that. And that's kind of cool. And I was like, well, I should probably share some of this. So here I am. And about you, well, I was hoping to target this talk specifically from for product designers and tech companies who don't manage people, but also want to exercise influence in their organization. And although this talk is specifically targeted towards this audience, if you are a designer in a studio or an agency, I think this is still helpful in that you kind of understand, like on the client side, what constraints they're dealing with, like how are they thinking about making decisions. I've worked also on the agency side, so it's kind of like always like, okay, I showed up with the great design, but how come they like thought about things that way, and it totally didn't play out the way that I thought about it. And some of this stuff might clarify how things are worked behind the scene. And another further point of clarification that I want to do is I kind of want to caveat that I'm assuming that you're not a lead designer or a designer in general where your explicit job is to determine influence like organization direction. I think it's a little bit different when you are an individual contributor, where your main job is to do design work. And then you also want to influence things, but it's outside of your job description, versus when it is explicitly upon you to do this work. It's a little bit different. And I kind of want to caveat that. Okay, so moving on, the goal today that I want everyone to walk away with is to understand how the game works and which levers are available to you. what it won't be possible today is to make you good at politics. I think as all designers know, it is totally one thing to learn about design and watch design and read about design. Like you can understand contrast, color, like, and all these core concepts really well, but it does not make you a good designer. And so it's the same for like navigating organizations. If you understand how to see the game that's being played and you understand how navigation works, it does not make you a skilled navigator. You kind of just have to practice a lot. So yeah, and the way that we're going to talk about this is in a couple of steps. So I think what's useful for us to do in the beginning is to align on a definition of what politics is. Like I mentioned, it's a fairly loaded term, and grounding us in the same slightly narrower definition would be helpful as we keep talking about this. And then I want to go over the two core concepts in politics, which is like the processes in organizations and how they and the normal way of arriving at decisions, and then the people in that process. So the decision makers, how to identify them, how to understand how they think and influence them. Okay, so that's kind of the agenda. And so let's start with the definition. And normally, this is kind of the thing that your professor told you not to do in college, which is to quote Wikipedia. But I was reading up this Wikipedia article, and I was like, actually, this quote pretty much says the exact thing that my textbook says. And I think it quotes from my textbook from college. And I was like, this is actually pretty good. So let's start with this, right? So what is politics? It's the use of power and social networking within an organization to achieve changes that benefit the organization or the individuals within it. It's a little bit of a mouthful. And I was asking my friend Charlie, with whom I've worked a long time, and he had a really succinct way of putting this. And I kind of want to put it up here. And he just calls it how to get things done when people have different goals. And I think that's a really good definition. And I think it's good because there are basically two parts to this, right? So one is that you're trying to get things done. And two is that like people disagree. And I think that that's pretty much the source of all politics in organizations. And by this definition, you're pretty much always in a political situation. And as your company grows like bigger, like people have different understanding of the objective. They have different opinions about the best ways of getting there. And it just multiplies for the number of people in your organization. So you're probably in all situations always kind of potentially in a political situation. And I think it's just a matter of choice, right? Like, do you want to engage or do you kind of want to let this slide? I want to also go through just a quick example and a non-example for what politics is to really like clarify this definition. So if you look back to this, right, it's like how to get things done when people have different goals. Implementing a change to sprint planning that you, your PM, and EM agree with is trying to get things done. But it is not a thing that your stakeholders disagree with, so it's not politics. On the other hand, if you're trying to convince your PM and EM to change something about the way that you guys do sprints, and they either haven't thought about it or they think differently, and you're trying to get them to see things your way, that's definitely politics. And the core concepts that I want to talk about when it comes to politics are processes and decision makers. So how does your org expect decisions to be made? And then who are the people making them? Okay, so let's jump into the first one, processes. In most organizations, processes are like this. You might have some local variations, but there is a high-level strategy / mission / objective that the organization is trying to accomplish. And the way that you accomplish this is through quarterly plans or some sort of midterm planning, right? It could be like half-based. It could be yearly-based. God help you if your organization plans yearly. That seems like hell. But there's like some kind of midterm planning. And then the midterm planning is broken down into sprints, right? So that's like kind of the software execution cycle. And that's generally the shape of all processes in tech organizations. And I think for most ICs, the scope of influence starts at sprint and move towards quarterly plan. And some ICs I've definitely seen operate at a more strategic level, but oftentimes you get there when you are at a level where it's kind of your explicit job to do that. So we'll focus a little bit more on the sprint and quarterly plan level. Cool. Okay. So what are the steps when you are trying to get in the process of decisions? So I think the first thing that you want to think about is the level at which you'd like to affect change, right? So suppose you have a thing that you want to do. The first thing you want to figure out is this like a sprint level thing, a quarterly level thing, and a strategic level thing? So on a sprint level, you can think of it as like, how do we meet our quarterly goals? So these are things, some examples of changes you might want to affect at this level are like, how do we triage bugs, right? Like, so how much of our time are we spending fixing bugs and making our existing product like marginally better versus shipping new features? Like every team has it differently, and you might want to move that dial up and down a little bit. You might want to influence the way that you guys do estimates for engineering, right? So like, are you guys accounting for enough time to get the quality of the features really right in your estimation, or are you guys cutting corners? You might want to sign up, you might want to influence the project sign-off process. So are you getting a final say on something that launches as a designer before it goes up to the public, or is it kind of just like rushed in like Thursday night for the Friday release because the engineers really like are trying to make their deadline, and then you don't get to see it, and then suddenly the quality is not as good? There's a myriad of things that you can try to influence on the sprint level. And that's probably where I expect most ICs to do a lot of their political work, is trying to make their sprints really good. And if you go up a level, there's quarterly planning. Quarterly planning is generally concerned with what we should work on this quarter. And you can substitute quarter for half or year in whatever organization that you're in. And the way that we think about things here is like the roadmap, right? Like that's the quintessential quarterly planning output. Like what is on and off the roadmap. And some other things to think about during quarterly planning is like, who are the people working on which items on the roadmap? So which team does what and in what order? These are also some of the decisions that you can influence on the quarterly level. And also another interesting thing to think about is the allocation of different types of projects. So how many of your projects are shipping new features? How many of your projects are improving existing stuff? How many of you are like technical debt, product debt, infrastructural kind of work? And these are quarterly conversations. And then finally, at the last level, you can think about this as like, what does this organization do in value? And that's the strategic levels, right? So what is the overall objective that we're trying to do here? What are the main loops that drive this objective? And how do the projects that we do in this organization plug into those loops? So that's kind of like a quick summary of like the different kinds of levels that you want to affect change at, and what some of these examples might be at these level. And one rule of thumb that I found really helpful when I think about the right level is generally when you're stuck, you want to go up a level. So one example of this is that like, okay, so you're doing sprints, and like the most typical thing that happens is that, why are we only prioritizing P1s as bugs, and then all the P2s and P3s get just like frozen in the backlog forever, right? It's like a very, very common situation for a lot of software teams. And what you want to do when you're in a situation like that is that like, hey, you talk to your PM, you talk to your EM, and you're like, listen, guys, how come we're only fixing things that are critically breaking the app, and we're unable to fix things that are just like quality of life things, or just like things that make our app better, but isn't like a thing that is completely broken? So you have these conversations with your PM and EM, you make your case, and then you're just kind of like really stuck. And generally, I've been in these situations a lot, and honestly, like every time this happens, it's probably because your counterparts are trying to protect some kind of quarterly objective, right? But the most classic one is that like, sure, we would in the abstract like to also fix the P3s and the P2s, but the reality is that we have signed up for a certain set of OKRs or /KPIs for this quarter. And we have a set of projects that we think are going to drive these OKRs and KPIs. And we have a tight timeline. And if we fix all the P2s, then we probably won't be able to ship some projects, which will then cause us to miss this metric, which we report up as an organization to the organization above, and that gets us in trouble and potentially like defunded. That sucks. Okay, so you're pretty much stuck at the sprint level because you're not going to be able to make any progress. So then like what you want to do is that you want to like up level. So you want to go like, okay, that's fine. We're not going to have this conversation at sprint level. Let's talk about it next quarter when we do our next quarter's planning, and just really look at our metrics. Are the metrics that we've signed up for like allowing us to fix the bugs that we want? Or is it too aggressive? Are the projects that we're doing like just filling up our whole quarter so that we don't get time to fix any bugs? And that's kind of how you level up that conversation and keep having it. And similarly, right, if you could be in a quarterly planning mode and like kind of get stuck there, and then so you have to go on a strategic level. And it's like, of course, every up leveling is a choice, right? You can just be like, hey, I'm comfortable operating at a sprint level, and if it's a quarterly level decision, I don't want to get involved. And similarly, you might not want to get involved in the strategic level, but it could be one of these situations where it's like you have this conversation on a strategic level. You're like, hey, guys, we're like a consumer app here, and like part of being a really good consumer app is to have a really good brand. And like a good brand comes from our product being polished and easy to use and delightful. And although it won't affect our metrics in the short run, and it won't impact our overall company strategy in the short run that we degrade in product quality, it does have some long-term consequence. So we might want to like amend our strategy to include more time for like driving the quality of our app. And that's kind of like a typical like escalation loop that you might want to run through. Okay, so now that you have a sense of like what happens at each level, you kind of want to start thinking about like who are the people who decide at this level. It's really obvious at the top and the bottom. So for the sprint level, it's like you, your PM, and your Eng lead. Pretty straightforward. You guys get in the room. Hopefully you have like bi-weekly or weekly meetings, and you just go talk. And at the very top level, that's also kind of like obvious. It's your executive team, right? It's the CEO and the people who report to him. Where it gets a little muddier is for quarterly planning. There's probably as many ways of doing quarterly planning as there are teams doing quarterly planning. And unfortunately, this is probably also where a lot of your energy will go. Because a lot of the times when you're trying to affect things on a sprint level, it always eventually, like we mentioned before, graduates to a quarterly planning conversation. So you really kind of want to suss this out. How does this work? And the best way to get a sense of how quarterly planning at your organization works is to just ask people who have been there for a couple of quarters how projects made their way onto this quarter's roadmap, right? It's kind of, if you want to learn about how this process works, it's good to look at examples of how this has worked on other projects in the past. So things that you might want to ask when you are sussing this out is, why are we working on this project versus that? And then you want to ask, okay, so if we're working on this project, why are we working on it now versus later versus earlier? Which also might give you a indication of what your organization's priorities are. And then you also want to like poke at like the ratio of new product versus improvements versus infra. Like why is this ratio this way? Like why do we value like these streams of work the way that we value them? And so poking at these things will give you a good plan, a good sense of how quarterly planning works. Okay, so once you figure that out, you figure out who, like, well, what level you're at, and then who decides at the level. You just got to convince the people making decisions at that level. Easy, right? Okay, so let's talk about the people who make decisions. I think the trivially true answer to this is that like your org's leadership makes the final decision for quarterly planning and most important decisions. This is true, but not particularly useful, because it's kind of like, okay, you can't just walk up to the guy and be like, yo, please do this, and they'll be like, yes, of course, you said so. It doesn't usually work like that, right? They're kind of like, if you try to book a meeting with them, they'll give you 15 minutes of their time, and then you like pitch them on this thing, they're like, yeah, great idea. I'll think about it. And then they kind of get nowhere. So instead, what you want to do is you want to start building a mental model of how your decision makers think. And the way that you do that is by talking to them and the people that they trust. And I want to emphasize the people that they trust part. If you already have a great relationship with your organization's leader, great. Go by all means, go talk to them directly, ask them stuff. But in a lot of cases, for a lot of people, like they don't necessarily have a great like a relationship to speak of. Not that it's bad, but it's just like their org's leadership might be in a different function, like 3 levels of, like above them, and there's just like no relationship to speak of. And if there's without a relationship, it's a little hard sometimes to get at what people think about. And so a really good proxy of what these leaders think about is what their people think about, right? Who are the people they trust, and how do these people think? And these people are far more interesting because they're actionable. So who are them? Who are they? Well, it's probably the people you expect. It's managers, OG employees, staff and lead design engineers, and designers if you have them, and some ICPMs. And I want to draw your attention to the last 3. I think these kinds of people are super interesting to talk to because they're underrated. They're not the obvious locus of power and decision in an organization. And so they generally have more time on their hands because their calendar is more open. And they're usually also more transparent because they don't have a team to manage. So they have fewer competing incentives they have to protect. So oftentimes you can just ask them straight up what's happening, and they'll tell you a straight up answer. And so I think it's great to grab coffee with these people. And what do you ask when you grab coffee with these people? Here are some questions you might want to think about. All right, so I broke them down into like a strategic, tactical, and like level. So you kind of just want to go through these and ask them, okay, what's the top thing that or cares about? And it's always interesting to hear what the differences are in what people think your org cares about. Where do you think that we'll land on this thing by the end of this year? And on a more tactical level, like what do you think of our current roadmap? Like where do you think we need more focus, less, and what OKRs are you most worried about? And so this kind of generally gives you an idea of what they think about the world, and by proxy, the sum of what their leader cares about. And then the last question that you want to ask, of course, at the end is who else I should talk to. And this basically gives you a loop that you can run through and just eventually like talk to all the people in your organization that your leader trusts. And you're getting these coffees, like always with the goal in mind that the objective is to understand how your org's leaders make their decisions. And the way that I found that's really helpful is that I have these like miniature versions of the leaders in my org in my head that I can just consult at any time, because I'm thinking about something and I can't just hit up the leaders and be like, yo, like, what do you actually think about this? So it's like, I like have these pictures of these miniature dolls in my head. I was like, I'm like doing this weird thing where I'm talking to them in my head, but it's really, really helpful. And the way that like, and sometimes I'm like, oh, actually my model of this leader is far more accurate than my model of this leader, because this leader, I don't really know what they're thinking about. So I'm going to go talk to the people that they work with and care and trust, and try to construct a more accurate model of them. And so usually by the end, when you have a good model, you're able to do a good approximation of these following questions, right? So what do they care about? What do they decide on versus what is not on them to decide on, which is also important. And who do they trust? And I think this is especially important for decisions that don't have a clearly designated forum. So like this is stuff that's like not fit for a design review, not fit for a product review, not fit for an engineering review. This is kind of like the gap space. And like when you're trying to operate in this gap space and trying to make change in this space, it's super important to know like how your leaders think, because you have to construct your own kind of mini forum for these change. Okay, that's a lot, but eventually you need to like for any decision that you have in your head or any plan that you want to implement, be able to quickly model for any leader who might be a decision maker, like these following questions, right? Who needs to agree? What information do they need to agree? At what forum should I bring this up? Or if there's no forum, how do I create a mini forum for this decision? What are the major arguments and support that I should bring? And then what are probably the objections that they're gonna have, and how do I handle them? And so having the mental model of these people in your head like makes you able to answer these questions, and ensures that your plan or proposal would be more successful. Okay, so to summarize, we started this talk saying that the goal is to understand the game and what levers are available to you. So these are the levers, right? So 1, you identify the level at which you are trying to affect change. 2, you find the decision makers at that level. 3, you build a mental model of how they decide. And then 4, you propose a plan. And you can scale this up and down for different kinds of decisions. So these 4 steps might look very different at a sprint level versus at a quarterly planning level versus at a strategic level. But the core concept is pretty much the same. So before we we close out here, I just want to field a couple of, I think, common objections. One is that I don't need to get political because like either somebody else is doing this stuff or I just like all my needs and desires are met without getting political. That's great. But also, I bet you sometimes agree, don't always agree with how your org's priorities at prioritizing quality versus speed. Sometimes you think features should be more polished. Sometimes you want user research to be more part of the process. Maybe you want features you think are important on the roadmap. You think the strategy is wrong or incomplete. All these thoughts could lead to a potential change that you want to propose. And if you want to propose a potential change, you might want to start thinking about how to navigate your organization. Okay, so maybe now you're at a point where it's like, okay, well, I see the value of doing this, but it still feels icky. And I get this a lot, and it's good, right? It means you're probably like a good person. And I would say, hey, the way that I've been able to bridge this is to think about it not for my own personal advancement, but for the advancement of something that I think is important for the organization. If you're navigating the organization and doing all these political things purely to like climb or to empire build, it feels really icky, and that's kind of icky, and that's kind of the kind of politics that people see on TV and go like, yeah, this is like the thing that I don't want to do. But if you are doing all this work because you believe that genuinely the thing that you believe is right is helpful for the organization, you're helping your org find the right priority. So it's not about you. It's about like helping the team. And that if you think about it that way, I think it's a lot less icky. And I think the last point that I'll add is just try not to hurt people. This is always a choice that you get when you're navigating organizations. Like there are decisions that might hurt people. You can choose not to make them. Like this is not a like either I don't do it or I do it entirely all the way. You can choose to do as much as you feel comfortable and to like draw your own boundaries. Okay. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about is, okay, so you have now a reason to do it and you no longer feel icky about it, but you're like, okay, I don't have any influence in this organization, so I can't do anything or make anything change. And it's actually not super complicated getting influence as a IC. There's a couple of things that you do over and over, and then eventually you'll have influence. One, you do the things that you say you will do over and over again. It's super straightforward, but that's like the best way of accumulating influence as an IC is to just be reliably the person who does things. And then if you have a person specifically that you want to influence, that you might want to work on projects they care about or see. And then when you do the things you say you will do on that project over and over again, they're like, oh shit, this person is pretty trustworthy. And when they tell me things, I should probably listen. And this is all helped by if you are willing to work at a place for more than 1.5 years, which is the Bay Area average. It's really hard to build your influence in an organization if you keep leaving the place after 1.5 years. So stick around. And if you always do reasonably well at an organization and you are stuck around, then you eventually almost inevitably grow to have influence. And then finally, the last point that I want to give is to ask for something that is a stretch and prove that it's a good idea. And this could be something that's a stretch for you or a stretch that's for the organization. And this basically means that this basically proves to the people in your org that you care to influence that when they trust you with their risk, that usually it works out. And if you keep doing this, next time you want to propose something, they're like, it's a little risky, but then again, like every other time that this person has taken on risk, it's panned out. So I think it might pan out in the future too. And I think that's it. That's the end of the talk. And I'm hoping that the channel is full of questions right now. Preet, are you saying something? I think you might be on mute.
I was muted. Yeah. Thank you. Still at the 101 stage of tech streaming and live streaming. So thank you so much. First of all, like that was a incredibly well structured talk around this, a very widely gray area of workplace politics. When you had submitted the topic, I was kind of curious. I was like, how would you go about, like talking about the different aspects of workplace politics? But you did an amazing, incredible job at that. So thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions. Some are more tactical, whereas some are more overarchingly like approach focused. So I'll start with some kind of more tactical ones. So Nathaniel Green is asking, I'm wondering how you balance blue sky innovation and hard measurable improvements, example, addressing more P2s and P3s when approaching these decision makers.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It depends on the direction that you feel like things are out of balance. I think the most depending on the organization you're in, like you could be in an organization that's always doing like incremental, measurable things and never reaching for things that are like less measurable. And I think in those situations, there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is that you might, the one thing that immediately jumps to mind is that you want to maybe identify the blue sky ideas that are already in the water. It's like most of these super unmeasurable blue sky ideas are really, really, really hard to get prioritized. And you would make your life a little easier when you start talking to people and you're like, oh, okay, so like there's like 10 of these crazy ideas, 7 of which like are only in my head, and 3 of them are like in the heads of a couple of people. Right. And you kind of want to start figuring out like there's probably like a ranking to like how crazy these ideas are. You probably want to like focus on the ones that are already in the water. And if you don't, if you really care about something that's not already in the water, you probably want to spend a couple of quarters like getting it in the water, right? By talking to people, by just like, like when you get an earworm, you basically want to give people the idea worm in their head. Right. And it's like you kind of have to like stretch your horizon up to like probably a few quarters, if not like a year, if you really want something big to get done. And then I would say that like as a designer, the most like politically correct or accepted way of making these changes happen is to run design sprints. I think people know generally at this point what design sprints are and kind of expect designers to be able to drive them. So one avenue for you to make that change is to run a successful design sprint. Otherwise, you might want to find like a sponsor who is willing to sponsor you for this project, either on like the product side or the engineering side, depending on what you're thinking about, and just go take that route. And if in the reverse, you guys are doing too many of these big projects and are always dropping the quality improvements on the floor, then it's just a matter of having a conversation that was like, what do we care about as an organization? Do we care about these bugs? Like, can we have a conversation around like our long-term objective and how this plays into our brand perception, how it plays around like our user experience and like how that deteriorates our brand. And that's kind of how I would think about it without knowing too much of exactly what kind of innovation you're talking about.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think the analogy of the planting the idea worm in people's head early on is that's a really good approach. And also I really like that you mentioned the finding a sponsor and how important that can be. I think especially when you're working in companies outside the Bay Area, quite often we'll see, or maybe it's more with early stage ICs, you'll see that designers are still, we are learning how to connect the craft part of the work to the business outcomes. So sometimes even making that connection around finding the sponsor does not seem as obvious. But that was a really, really good point. We had another question from Pavi, which was around like, are you able to share any, workplace politics example that kind of you personally experienced and how you were navigating about it? And I had kind of a similar question around when you were trying to tackle it more from a people approach and if it went wrong or, not the way that you had expected.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's to answer your question. I think when people expect, like when people think, say, like, oh, like I did something like kind of political and it went wrong. There's this like kind of like picture in our head that's like, oh, it really backfired and now I'm screwed. The
Right.
reality of things going wrong is that there's nothing happens unless
Right.
it's truly, truly wrong, and then
Right.
you really like screw things up. Then they're like, okay, well, but most of the time you don't screw things up. You kind of, nothing just happens. So I just
Right.
I'm having this trouble like thinking of like times when it's like a specific example, because like literally I do this all the time and that something just never happens, right? So like
Right.
for a year, I was trying to get our organization to spend more time getting the quality of our features up, and like I tried a bunch of things. And so I try to do like, okay, let's do mandated bug bashes, and let's make sure that the designer has the time to sign off on features before they're shipped.
Right.
Sure, it worked kind of, but not really. Right? It's like, okay, what if like I just prioritize all the bugs, which is like a crazy idea. That didn't work too well either. And so it's just like, that's kind of the failure mode when you try to do something and it didn't work. It's just
Right.
nothing happens,
Nothing
which is
happening.
okay. And it's like people see, like, it's actually I would say it's even like kind of a positive. Like even when you try to do things that people recognize are generally useful and that you're trying to change things, even if it doesn't work out, people are like, oh yeah, this guy's trying, and you know, like it didn't work this time, but like we now know he's a person who is willing to try things, and it's like it's still good on you.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, in my past experience working at some of the companies, especially when you're working in a services based in a company like an agency, I think the working around people can get really tricky and nuanced, and so you definitely, like, this topic is extremely relevant to folks in those situations or those work environments. And so with me, once it did go, I would say like where it backfires is where things get misunderstood. So trying to navigate projects, especially when it's a third party involved, and designers, developers, product managers working together, but you'll often see the sales and BD teams in an agency environment at times being excluded. And that's where I personally had a few experiences where things get misinterpreted, and the best solution was actually to just start over communicating with those folks and not just talking about the work we are doing within the design team. So kind of moving across the silo.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good call out. It's a generally like people, if you screw it up, people don't feel like they're included, and you lose a little bit of trust. But these are never kind of like trapdoor decisions. They're always kind of like, oh, like this time around it didn't feel brought along, I'll just make sure to do it next time. It just never really backfires that much. It just maybe temporarily is like a setback in your relationship.
Right. Very true. Jason had an interesting question, which seems around a specific scenario, which is, leaders are seeking personal advancement by sometimes throwing the IC designers under the bus, even potentially firing them, and HR is not helping you. What actions would you suggest?
Man, this is spicy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trying to think through this. I mean, it's really, really hard to like comment on this without knowing the specific situation. So I'm almost a little reluctant to say anything because it might just feel wrong. But yeah, in general, it's like, I guess I could just speak generically about this. I would think about things as like people are not bad guys in their head, right? It's like no convincing villain is ever the villain in their own story. So I think it's just like, it's super, super hard to do this when you feel like you're under threat and the person is like acting with ill will, but like extend the same empathy that you do to user to this person, not because like you necessarily really deeply care about this person, but you want to try to understand like in their self narrative, like what are they trying to do? And like why are they doing the things they're doing? And I think that kind of like helps you understand their positions better and like helps you potentially work around them a little better. And honestly, if that's not successful and like you've tried your best being empathetic and trying to work around things, it's probably time to leave. Like there are situations where like you're kind of stuck in an organization and like trying to fight it and trying to change things might be like more effortful than just leaving and going somewhere else. And that kind of happens. And it really sucks, but that might be the way.
Right. That was, I think, based on the question and the information we have, I think that was the perfect answer. And definitely a practice that I think designers and, even socially, I think a lot of us do not do, which is like really, I think we throw around the word empathy a lot, right? So, designers, most important skill, empathy, but we don't use it often in the context of outside our craft and outside the users that we're building products for. And I think in the teams that we work with and stakeholders, that can definitely be improved. Because again, I think if we start with the assumption that they don't, the intention is not wrong, I think you can at least unravel quite a few other reasons of why they are behaving in the way they are. So that's really, really well put. We'll take two more questions. So we have, I think you kind of already touched upon it, but might be worth either summarizing or going into a little bit detail on it. So Cassia is asking how to talk about the experience with politics at work that strongly influenced a project in a job interview. And that can also be quite nuanced, right? Like you do not want to, if it went either way, especially when things do not go, the right way. In your job interview, do you openly talk about it? Do you own it on yourselves, or how do you tackle that?
So it kind of depends a little bit on like how bad it really was and how dirty things were. If it was truly like kind of like, damn, this stuff better stay under like never see the light of the day, then like, okay, don't talk about it. But it was kind of like, it was kind of not that great, or it was like from like not that great to like actually it worked pretty well. I think talk about it, and you should actively talk about it and describe how you navigated it. For me, in like a lot of the interviews that I've done, one of the things that I look for, especially in more senior designers, is that like it's kind of just like inevitable that when you are more senior that you get caught in these situations. And if you are able to describe how you work through these situations with a past example, both when you have been successful and when you have not, and how what you've learned when you were not successful and why you think you were not successful and how you would do things differently, that is a really, really positive sign. It's one of the things that I look for in like in a lot of interviews. It's like this person can design, that's great, but it's like, does this person also need to be protected? It's like, is this person like a really, really good craftsperson, but just like whenever they're caught in like a situation where they have to talk to a PM or an engineering manager who disagree, like they suddenly kind of shrivel up and like somebody else needs to step in. It just creates a lot of work for other people too. So it's like, ideally you want somebody who's like really good at design and also is like, oh, now they're in this situation with a PM and a design engineering manager, they will be fine. And that's kind of the person you want to hire. And like when you can talk about your experiences constructively, I think that's like actually a pretty good plus one in your profile.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think quite often, again, when you are still early in your career, it can sound like the analytical decision is to, amp up the end result, and either show that the project still worked amazing or kind of offload the blame. And quite often, the interviewers are not that interested in the outcome of the project itself, but how you dealt with the people issues of it. So the project could still have not launched or went either ways. But I think they are more interested in figuring out how you tackle the situation. Okay, we will take one more. There are quite a few good questions. And let me see. Okay, so we will go with the question. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Shaili Badani is asking, I recently received interview calls from 2 companies. And then one of the common questions they asked was, which projects are the ones you got paid for? So I'm assuming she works as a either contractor or freelancer. Can you share your expert advice to why such a question is asked from the applicants?
That's interesting. I don't think I don't know if you have had experience with this question, and maybe you can help me give a little bit of context. But I don't think I've ever gotten a question like this.
Right. Yeah. I think. So again, one of the challenges with these questions is we lack the context on the person and their background, so it can be tough. I'm assuming, and I've asked a different variant of this question, which is if you are early in your career, or if you're hiring for an early stage designer, these days you get a lot of bootcamp school students or students that are passed out of even a design school, and so a lot of those projects that they present in their case studies are what do you call?
They're like kind of like student projects, right? There's not a real real company.
Not real life projects, but I'm forgetting the name, like not dummy projects, but
Got it. Yeah.
And so, I think she's asking, like, why are those questions asked? Because
whenever that question is being asked, I don't think it's actually like, they're not kind of like, this is not a question that is the meat of the interview. It usually is a clarifying question to give them the context on like how they should think about each of your case studies. Like, nobody is ever going to say like, oh, because you answered this way on this question versus that, we did not give you the job. This is usually okay. So like, just to make sure I understand like the context around which this design was done, like, tell me if this was a student project versus a paid client work. I wouldn't worry about it a ton if that is really like, if the Preet's definition of it is really the question.
Again, I'm assuming that, and I think even to kind of sum up the whole reason why we had this talk and why Yitong spoke on the subject was that whenever you are called in for an interview, there is a very high chance that the craft part, the work part, or the pixels part, if to just to stereotype all the designers there, that part is kind of judged a little bit from your portfolio already, and that's why you've been called in for the interview. And when they are interviewing a candidate, a lot of focus is also on your people skills, right? So of course, you have the hard skills, soft skills, or pixel skills and people skills. And so one of the reasons is, like, when you do work on these dummy projects, and when you're working on fictional projects, as case studies, there is a massive difference in the amount of people related challenges that you would have had if you were working with a real client. And it doesn't matter if that client is a Fortune 500 company or it's a mom and pop store. A lot of those challenges are the same when you're dealing with subjective opinions and constraints around timelines, budgets, and going across some of the frameworks that you've been taught in school. So a lot of those challenges can only be truly faced when you are working with real humans and on real business problems. So again, massive assumption that-that's what Shaili wanted to ask. But yeah, that already brings us to the end of this virtual talk. Thank you so much, Yitong. This was, I think we should definitely have more follow-up sessions on this topic. Like, again, just seeing from the interest, the questions, and the engagement. I think, again, it's a topic that not many of us talk openly about.
Cool. Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Hope to you stay safe, and maybe hope you make it to Canada once things open up.
I hope so too.
Yeah, have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our second virtual talk. Next week we have our 5 to 9 conference, a 3-day virtual conference on side projects and freelancing, and so there will be no virtual talk next week. But after that, you'll see, we are aiming to have at least 2 to 3 virtual talks every month on different topics, different sessions. So please do share your feedback. We'll send a feedback form to everyone. You could also just share it in the Slack group on how we can improve these sessions. You can share your feedback around the topics and kind of speakers that you would love to hear from. And we will be back in 2 weeks with our next virtual talk. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, on the website, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Periscope, and have a good one. Thank you so much. Bye.